During that same time, through my 1.5% annual repayment, I'll also have reduced my loan by roughly 20,000 euros as well. That means that in 10 years, I'll have created more than 45,000 euros in equity. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Hans, I currently own 13 apartments in Germany and I help expats find, analyze and invest in properties here. In today's video, we'll dive deeper into the most important steps when buying a property, the financial due diligence. I'll take you through the full financial analysis of the apartment I'm buying in Freiburg. We'll go through all of the numbers together, from purchase costs and financing to cash flow and taxes, so you can see exactly how I evaluate whether a property is financially sound or not. If you watched my previous video of how I found the apartment, this is then the next step, the detailed breakdown behind the decision to buy it. And if you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend watching it first. You can have a look at it here. Before we get into the numbers, let's quickly clarify what financial due diligence actually means. It's the process of carefully reviewing the financial aspects of a possible real estate investment. The goal is to answer one simple question: does this property make financial sense for me? And that means checking how much does the property actually cost, including all closing fees? What conditions do I get from my bank? What's the realistic rental income? And most importantly, what's the actual cash flow that can be derived from this investment after all taxes and expenses? Doing this step thoroughly protects you from bad surprises later and helps you make confident investment decisions. So now let's start with my detailed Excel spreadsheet. And that's the spreadsheet I always use for all of my real estate evaluations. I built the spreadsheet myself, and if you want to get it, make sure to visit my website germanrealty.org/shop. So now I'd say let's jump right in. What you can see here is the spreadsheet I was just mentioning. It's basically separated into two different sections. One is the initial property evaluation you can see here. It's basically this fast evaluation which you can go through, and then on the bottom here you have a detailed cash flow calculation as well for the years 1 to 10, because as we know, after 10 years you can sell the property tax-free, and that is of course always the plan. So let's go to the first section here. What you can of course type in here is the basic property purchase information. So that means you fill in all of the fields, and by the way, you only have to fill in all of the blue fields, and then it automatically calculates all of the other fields, right? And that's of course the value of this spreadsheet, right? It makes a lot of things really a lot easier for you. So let's quickly go through this, right? So you type in the property address here. I'm just going to leave it as it is as of now. You type in the square meters. You can derive that, of course, from the expose. In this case, for this apartment, it's 26.5 square meters. You type in the property price, 135,000 euros in this case, and then it automatically calculates the price per square meter, of course. What you then have are the broker fees, and that's already the first sort of part of our total closing costs. In most cases, you do have to pay this broker fee. It of course depends on whether you have found this property through a broker, let's say on Immobilien Scout or another platform. And in this case, you then have to pay for these broker fees. Now, these broker fees are usually 3.57% of the purchase price, right? Sometimes, and that's written in the expose as well, this amount might be a little bit higher or even lower. But as I said, in most cases, it's 3.57%. So then it automatically calculates, of course, the amount which is going to be due for these broker fees. Same goes for the notary fees. These are usually always 1.5%, so 2,000 euros in this case. Then you also have to pay for the land registry office fees, 675 euros in this case. And then you also do have the property transfer tax. Now, and that depends on the state in which you're buying your property. In Baden-Württemberg, where this property is located, you need to pay 5% in property transfer tax, and that equals 6,750 euros. That means overall we do have closing costs of around 11% of the purchase price, or 14,200 euros overall in closing costs. If we now add the closing costs to the purchase price, we can get a value of 149,000 euros more or less in here, and that's sort of the whole amount of investment we would have to make at some point. Now let's get to the rent part here. Of course, you also need to decide what you can rent the apartment out for, right? It very much depends on whether the apartment is empty or whether you buy the apartment and it is already rented out. Now, in this case, the apartment is going to be empty once I will get the full ownership of the apartment. And that means I'll be able to rent it out to a new renter, and I can sort of set the price to the level I would want it to have. Of course, there are some restrictions you also have to keep in mind, such as the Mietspiegel, and I'll definitely do another video, a separate video about this at some point, but definitely keep the Mietspiegel in mind in the city in which you're renting out your apartment. Now, what I use for my calculation are the 21 euros here per square meter. Of course, I'm going to rent out the apartment furnished, which means that this is going to be ideal for, let's say, students who are going to study in Freiburg and then just need a place to stay for just a short period of time, let's say, I don't know, 1 to 3 years. And there are actually a lot of students looking for furnished apartments in Freiburg. So overall, I'm going to go with the 21 euros per square meter, and the cold rent will then be 550 euros more or less. I don't have a parking space included here, so I'm not going to charge anything for it, of course. And then we also do have the allocable costs. We'll get to that part here in a second. However, you can already see the total warm rent is then going to be 652 euros for this apartment. Now, we also do have the section of depreciation, right? As you know, you can depreciate 2% of the property's building's value per year. In German tax law, it's written that buildings are depreciated over a span of 50 years, and hence we do have the 2% AFA here. There are some exceptions for it. Let's say for very old buildings, it's 2.5%. But here we're looking at this 2% depreciation rate. As I said, only on the building's value here. We also have the share of the building and purchase price, which is 70%. In this case, this is a rough estimate, which I use in most cases, which means that 70% of the purchase price are going to be attributed to the building only, and 30% are going to be attributed to the ground, which cannot be depreciated, right? And that's very important to understand. Of course, you can only depreciate the building's value. In this case, as I said, 70% of the overall purchase price of 135,000 euros, which would accumulate then to 104,000 euros more or less, right? And of this amount, we can depreciate 2% per year. Then we do have a couple of assumptions here, which I'm going to leave as they are at the moment. We do have cost increase of, let's say, 2% per year, also a rent increase of, let's say, 2%, and also a value increase of 2%, meaning in line with inflation. If we now go to the next column here, monthly management cost, this is where it gets interesting, right? As you know, the management costs are split up between allocable costs and non-allocable costs. Allocable costs are the costs the renter needs to pay for, right? And non-allocable costs are the costs you as the owner or the investor need to pay for. Allocable costs may include, let's say, costs for heating, costs for maintenance, basic maintenance. Non-allocable costs are the costs usually for the management company, and also other costs such as basic repairs, renovations, and so on. In this case, we do have allocable costs of 96 euros. Of course, you need to know where the allocable costs come from, and for that you either have a look at your exposé, right? Sometimes it's actually written in here what the shares are between allocable and non-allocable costs. But in the worst case, you can also have a look at your Wirtschaftsplan, which would be sort of the estimation for the upcoming year, right? And therefore includes the most current or actual numbers, or you can use the last Abrechnung of the previous year, right? But in this case, the exact numbers are also written in the exposé, so let's have a look at that. Here it's written that the renter needs to pay 96 euros per month, so we'll include that here. Plus there's going to be a property tax, and that varies as well from apartment to apartment. But I would say for a similar apartment like this in Freiburg, you would need to pay, I don't know, 5 euros, maybe 7, 8, 9 euros per month in property tax. So really not a lot. And that's of course also what the renter needs to pay for, right? Which means that we have total allocable costs of around 101 euros, right? Then we also have non-allocable costs, and these are written also in the exposé here. As I said, if you can't find it in the exposé, use the Wirtschaftsplan or the Abrechnung. Here it's written that it's 70 euros, and let's see, not sure if that includes the renovation or the reserves, but I think it does. And that's why we have 24 euros in here, which means that of the 70 euros non-allocable costs, including the reserves, 24 euros are attributed to the reserves themselves, which means that we have total non-allocable costs of 70 euros. And that, of course, if you add those two together, total allocable costs and non-allocable costs, you get to the amount of 166 euros of overall Hausgeld. And that is the amount that is going to be deposited from your account. Just to give you another example, as I said, we do have the Abrechnung here as well, or the Wirtschaftsplan. And here you just take the amount of 1,150 euros divided by 12, then you have the allocable costs, and for the non-allocable costs, you take the 837 euros divided by 12, and that's then the amount you put in here. If we go back, there's another section which is also really interesting, the financing part, right? In most instances, I would like to finance 100% of the purchase price. And that's also what I'm going to do for this one here, right? Which means that the loan amount is going to be 135,000 euros. I will need to bring in some equity, in this case, roughly 14,000 euros. And that's exactly the closing costs. That's in most cases what the banks want, right? You cover the closing costs and then you finance 100% of the purchase price. My bank already made me an offer to get the loan for 3.75% for a 5 years fixed interest period, which means that the interest which I will need to pay on this loan, 3.75%, is going to be the same for the next 5 years. After that, I will need to refinance my loan, which means I can either go to the same bank and ask them whether they would finance it again for the outstanding loan, which is still remaining, or I'm just going to go to another bank and ask them to make me an offer. So that's what I chose. I also chose a repayment rate of 1.5%, which means that on this loan of 135,000 euros, I repay 1.5% per year. And that brings me to a debt service of 590 euros, which I will need to pay to my bank. And that includes, as I said, interest and the repayment of the loan. And that's, of course, on a monthly basis. Now let's have a look at this column here on the right. We do have rent and rental yield. You can see the net cold rent per year, which is roughly 6,700 euros. You can see the gross rental yield of 5% and the factor of cold rent versus price of 20. And that's, of course, a really good value already for a property which is roughly 20 years old, only in a still very good condition. And that's why this is such a good deal. If we look at the cash flow calculation real quick, you can see how the cash flow can be derived. It's a pretty easy calculation. You take the warm rent, in this case 650 euros, of course, as we said. You have the management costs of 166 euros. You do have the interest of 420 euros, which I would need to pay on a monthly basis, and the repayment of, again, roughly 170 euros per month. That's, of course, all of these numbers are calculated from the numbers we have put in previously. Now, what you can see here is a negative cash flow of 100 euros, which means that before taxes, I would need to chip in 100 euros on a monthly basis out of my own pocket, right? Many of you are always asking me what is sort of an acceptable cash flow, and I would say for an apartment which is really modern like this one, as I said, only 20 years old, in a really good condition overall, I would easily or happily pay 100 euros per month out of my own pocket in order to have this property, right? What you could also do, of course, is try to increase rent. If we, instead of 21 euros per square meter, I'm just going to put 22 euros per square meter here. Of course, cash flow improves by, I don't know, 30 euros in this case, more or less. If we charge even more, which would be maybe not possible due to rent laws, right? Like the Mietspiegel, cash flow would be even better, right? So that's something you can play around with to then find out whether you would be having a positive cash flow or not. In the next step, you also have the taxes, right? You can see the tax calculation here. It's similar to the cash flow calculation, but it's a bit different, right? There are some other things such as depreciation, which is included in the tax calculation, but not in the cash flow calculation. It's basically an expense for which you don't really make a payment, right? Depreciation is just, from a tax perspective, an expense, but it's not really a cash outflow out of your bank account, let's say. If we have a look at that calculation, you can see a taxable cash flow of only negative 133 euros. Then we do have my personal marginal tax rate of, let's say, 42% if you earn more than 67,000 euros per year. And that gives you then a tax refund, actually, in this case, of 55 euros. So if you deduct the 55 euros from the negative cash flow of 104 euros, you actually get to a positive cash, or still negative cash flow, of 48 euros after taxes. So effectively, after taxes, I only have to chip in 48 euros instead of these 104 euros before taxes, which makes it of course even more attractive for me. Maybe as a last step, let's quickly have a look at the detailed cash flow calculation here. You can see the basic and most important in and outflows, especially at the beginning. Of course, you need to pay for the apartment, you have the closing costs, which you need to pay for. If we go further down here, you get the financing of 135,000 euros. You do have the net cash flow calculated for each of the years. Of course, in the first year, you need to cover a lot of closing costs, and that's why they are also shown up here. And this is really for experts, I would say, and for you if you really want to have a view of how the cash flow is going to be for the next couple of years. One last hint before we stop this video here. Of course, I talked to my bank about this, right? And they are really happy to finance this property for me or with me. They actually said that based on their internal evaluations, this property is worth around 170,000 euros, which means that I'm, of course, buying this property significantly below market price, right? Basically, if I would even include the closing costs in this calculation, I would still make a profit of, let's say, 20,000 euros just with this apartment, just by signing the contract, right? So that's a really good deal overall, as I said before. Now, what we haven't discussed yet is the big picture, right? Over the next 10 years, even if rents and property values only increase modestly by these assumed 2% per year, this apartment will likely grow in value from 135,000 euros all the way up to more than 160,000 euros. During that same time, through my 1.5% annual repayment, I'll also have reduced my loan by roughly 20,000 euros as well. That means that in 10 years, I'll have created more than 45,000 euros in equity, or just with an initial investment of only 14,000 euros. And that's the power of real estate leverage. The tenant and the bank financing work together, grow your wealth slowly but consistently. So what can we take away from this analysis? Number one, always do your due diligence, right? Don't just look at the rent and the purchase price. You really need to include all of the costs, expenses, tax benefits, and so on. Number two, the property doesn't always need to be cash flow positive. In a strong location in a city such as Freiburg, it's about stability, tax efficiency, and long-term value growth. And number three, even a small property such as this one can be a great building block for your portfolio if you structure it right and understand the numbers correctly. And that's a detailed financial due diligence video for this week. In the next video, I'll show you the next step of analyzing this property, and that is going through all of the documents in more detail, right? So that means we're going to have a look at all of the relevant documentation, such as the Energieausweis, the Abrechnung, the protocols, and so on. Now, if you want me to help you analyze or even find a property for you, make sure to visit germanrealty.org/services. I hope you really liked this video. If you found it useful, make sure to like it, subscribe to this channel, and if you do have any questions, just put them down in the comment section down below. I hope to see you guys soon. Take care. Bye.